Hello and welcome back to part 2 of terrible Victorian jobs. I hope you enjoyed part 1. If you haven't watched part 1, I will leave a link to it in the pinned comment. Now, there's not much of an introduction needed, besides a thank you to my patrons and thank you in advance for liking and subscribing. Now, with that out of the way, let us get on to it. The first job we're looking at today is that of the pure finder. That doesn't sound so bad, doesn't it? Well, although the title, Pure Finder, sounded clean, it was actually one of the dirtiest scavenging jobs that you could get. When they say pure, they actually mean dog waste, which was gathered from the streets by the pure finders, who then sold them to tanneries. You see, in the final stages of leather tanning, dog waste was used to soften and purify hides. The enzymes within it helped remove hair and make the leather a bit more gentle. So, the pure finder's daily routine consisted of searching for dog feces in city alleys, parks, and courtyards, carrying a wooden spatula, scraper, and a bucket, usually with a lid. At least that helped a little bit. Every time they saw a new pile of dog waste, they would go and add it to the bucket. Pure finders frequently had their regular routes they would check, such locations as where stray dogs roamed or where carriage horses, with accompanying coach dogs of course, might stop. It was a door-to-door, street-to-street hustle. They would either take the collected dung to a dealer or straight to the tannery district. There were numerous tanneries in London's Bermondsey neighbourhood to sell it by the bucketful, once the bucket was full or the day was over. Tanners kindly called the product pure, and those who collected it took the term as a perverse badge of the trade. The word pure itself is derived from the industry. Pure finders trudged through filthy, horse manure-strewn streets of the city, working outside in every weather condition. The grind never stops. In an effort to locate the overnight deposits before street sweepers or pedestrians trampled them underfoot, they frequently got started early in the morning. Of course, the work was very solitary and odorous. With a foul-smelling bucket in hand, a pure finder may walk for miles with their eyes fixed upon the ground. Some chose to handle the waste with a single glove, usually on the right hand, while others preferred to use their bare hands and simply rinse them off, because it was just difficult to keep the glove clean anyway. I still would have preferred the glove. All day long, they had to put up with the smell of their product coming from the bucket and their hands. Well, one can only imagine when they made the deal at the end of the day at the tannery, it was not a handshake agreement. At least I hope not. Added to this, they were, as you can imagine, surrounded by flies. Pure finders frequently slipped on the dung unintentionally or stepped in the very thing that they were looking for. They also needed to be somewhat discriminating, because dog feces at the time might be mixed with straw or have a specific desired consistency. Of course, dried feces would fetch a different price because of the enzymes, not as potent. Trying to do my best with the descriptions here. I know this is a good one to start with. According to some sources, older white dog droppings were rich in ammonia, and drier were actually preferred by pure finders. Other than a scraper, they lacked any practical tools, and their only form of protection was probably just some old boots. A pure finder would be physically exhausted from walking and bending down so much by the end of the day, of course, and they would probably be reeking, which of course caused people to avoid them. They constantly were exposed to bacteria and parasites while handling the animal waste. through hand-to-mouth contamination, they ran the risk of contracting intestinal infections or illnesses like dysentery, which, of course, can be a death sentence on its own. Any cut to the hand could become infected with something nasty from the feces if they are not wearing gloves or practicing good hygiene, in addition to being a stressful and frankly demeaning job. Purefinders frequently faced harassment from street urchins or derision from bystanders for literally picking up waste. Additionally, approaching a new pile could enrage a stray dog defending its territory, increasing the risk of dog bites. The contents of the bucket would stew and release ammonia fumes on hot days, which could cause respiratory and visual irritation. Purefinders had their own special little disease, Glover's itch, a type of eczema that is known to occur in people who come into contact with tanning liquids such as dog dung solution or chronic skin conditions of the manner. Malnutrition and fatigue were also risks. Many purefinders were elderly people, unable to perform more strenuous labor, and the lengthy walks, while malnourished, could result in collapses or disease. Although it wasn't a job as immediately dangerous as mining or toshing, the health effects of spending every day in filth, well, they were as real as any other danger. As their immune systems were continuously put to the test, furthermore, purefinders' mental health might be impacted by their social isolation, because few friends wanted to hang out with somebody who smelled like a kennel. Now, we have talked in the previous episode about the night men who would go around and empty the sewers. At least they usually worked in teams. But the purefinder, that was a solitary existence. Apart from being a source of mockery, they were essentially invisible in society. But it may surprise you to learn that this wretched labor could actually provide a small but necessary income. Not as good as some other things, but certainly not as bad. For each bucket of dog dung, purefinders were usually paid 8 to 10 pence, about half a shilling per bucket, since 20 pence is equivalent to a shilling, by the way. If lucky, a diligent purefinder could fill a bucket or two each day. Midway through the 20th century, Henry Mayhew observed that a hard-working purefinder could earn about £13 annually, which is definitely not to be snuffed at for the poor. It was marginally harder than what a street beggar might have make, on par with the earnings of other street scavengers. Price may be influenced by the quality of the pure. Dry, aged droppings with high ammonia content were actually reported to command a higher price. As long as there was supply, there was constant demand, because tanning simply required as much as possible. Since purefinders only had a bucket and possibly a cheap scraper, their earnings were not offset by operating expenses, perhaps with the exception of soap and water if they bothered with that, but I'm not holding my breath, or rather I am holding my breath. Of course, there was a limited supply of waste on London streets, and hundreds of purefinders were looking for it, so the competition could be quite intense. Ironically, purefinders offered a kind of cleaning service, because more dogs meant more waste, which made the streets unpleasant for everyone else. At least with the pay, it was somewhat on subsistence level, with their meager daily income going towards tea, stale bread, and possibly inexpensive housing. Many purefinders lived hand to mouth, which is probably not the best way to put it, but that's how it is. Now, in Victorian England, purefinders were considered to be at the bottom of the social scale. Their occupation was viewed by their peers as both repulsive but also somewhat humorous. Because of their work, people would avoid purefinders in conversation and in society, and they would literally avoid them on the street because they smelled horrible. There was occasionally a hint of sympathy, because, as Mayhew had noted, there were frequently elderly women or poor widows who simply had no other way to make money, and you must feel sorry for them. Imagine your own grandmother, or your mother, grandfather, or your father having to do such a thing. You wouldn't want them to be thrown away by society like this. However, these pure finders were frequently the target of jokes, because Victorians had a strong sense of scatological humour, and the pure finders were simply the most convenient target. Henry Mayhew details pure finders in London Labour and the London Poor, highlighting their surprisingly business-like approach to such a filthy trade and securing their place in history. But what about the tanners? Surely they were happy to receive the product that they so needed. Well, tanners did not show respect for the people who gathered, even though they undoubtedly valued the material they bought. In essence, society made a collective effort to ignore them, much like the aforementioned night soil men, since they removed something unsavory and exclusively beneficial to industry. A pure finder would be greeted with insults or curled noses, and that's if they were noticed at all. Nevertheless, there were only one of many scavengers in the street work community, besides mudlarks, toshers, rag and bone men. Things like this, we'll get to them. All of whom just trying to make a living from the city's abandoned waste. Since someone had to sit next to you at the end of the day when you smell of such a substance, well, they might find some camaraderie in perhaps sticking to their own. However, in general, Victorian society regarded their line of work with a mixture of disgust and humour, appreciating that someone was willing to do it, but content to keep them at a distance. Well, once again, we're off to a good start, aren't we? Alright, now these one or two videos are perhaps the filthiest videos that I've done, so you'll have to forgive me when I'm trying to explain things in the most polite manner as possible. But at least we got that one out of the way. This one's not so bad. The mudlark. In essence, a mudlark was a river scavenger who made a living by searching for valuable items in the mud of the Thames River at low tide. These individuals were usually children or extremely impoverished adults. They would wade into the muck-covered banks of the river when the tide was out and pour through the slime in search of treasures, or more frequently trash that could be sold. Typical finds included stray pieces of wood, lost coins, bones, pieces of rope or canvas, lumps of coal that had fallen from barges, and scrap metal such as nails and bits of iron. Driftwood might be collected and then sold as firewood. Bones and metal could be sold to rag and bone shops for a few pence, and coal could be dried and sold cheaply to low-income families for fuel. Mudlarks were basically the best recyclers of Victorian waste. After all, everything sort of got thrown into the river. Now, no one really hired a mudlark. Instead, they just went out and did the work, selling whatever they discovered. A large number of mudlarks, too, were homeless kids who saw it as a daily struggle for survival. They waited for the waters to subside before squelching into the dirty riverbed, frequently wearing tattered clothing and simply going barefoot, searching for solid objects by feeling through the sticky mud. Now, I said that this one was slightly less unpleasant, but only slightly. Of course, the mudlark had its own dangers, perhaps more than the pure finder. He lived in a hazardous, cold and dirty environment. During the Victorian era, the Thames shore was essentially an open sewer, with raw industrial and human waste flowing straight into the river. See The Great Stink of London. I made a video on that a while back. That might interest you. Mudlarks would be wading through a disgusting concoction of human waste, dead animals, rotting trash and mud. One could easily sink to their knees in the thick, sucking mud. In the summer, the stench was intolerable. In the winter, the icy mud would almost have them succumb to frostbite. They frequently worked in loose bunches of groups, not so much because they wanted to work together, but because they were all drawn to the same low tide, picking through mud and sludge up to their waist. The mudlarks spent hours hunched over. They ran the risk of getting cut by jagged objects that could sever bare feet or fingers, such as broken glass, rusty nails, and scrap metal that were concealed beneath the mire. They also needed to watch the river, because the tides of the Thames, they could rise swiftly, and many mudlarks could be and were caught off guard as the water rushed back, the unwary drowning. By the end of a session, they were usually covered in head to toe in foul-smelling mud, and clothing offered very little protection. They would drag themselves to a dealer, such as a rag shop, to sell their haul after collecting their finds in a sack or pockets, frequently still shivering and covered in muck. Working outside in the blazing sun or driving rain was demoralizing and exhausting, and they were always worried that the next step or wave might be their last. One could argue that mudlarks had to deal with every danger that the city had to offer. Drowning was a risk because of the incoming tide, especially for those who might venture a little too far out. A tiny mudlark might become trapped in sludge that resembles quicksand and be unable to escape, and the mud itself could turn into a maze. Cuts on the feet and other physical injuries were frequent. Because of the filth, even small wounds frequently resulted in dangerous infections. A large number of mudlarks hobbled on infected legs or feet. Henry Mayhew recounts a child who was lamed for months after he sunk a copper nail into his foot in the mud. Diseases were common. Wading in the sewage exposed one to parasites, cholera, typhoid, or hepatitis. They most likely suffered from diarrhea and chronic illness. Additionally, the work was sometimes very cold, causing rheumatism or hypothermia in people who were always wet. Mudlarks frequently had chronic coughs, which could have been caused by the tuberculosis made worse by their appalling living circumstances. There was also the chance of getting bitten by a sewer rat, which was common in the mud, and could bite a scavenger who was sticking a hand into a crack. Another risk was the human element. Occasionally, mudlarks would venture too close to shipyards and docks, where they were not welcome, and might be pursued or even attacked by watchmen. It was a psychologically difficult existence. Child mudlarks lived day to day, constantly competing with one another for scraps, which could result in fights between the frantic scavengers. As a last humiliation, a mudlark might be arrested or imprisoned if they were found to be stealing. For example, stealing some coal from a barge instead of merely picking up random lumps on the shore. In fact, a 13-year-old mudlark had told Mayhew that he would rather be confined for a brief period of time, where he would receive food and dry shelter, than to be left freely on the muddy banks. The mudlark's earnings were scarce and uncertain too. According to Mayhew's work, the majority of mudlarks only made an average of 3 pence per day, when 12 pence was worth a shilling. That is 3 in old pence, basically not even a quarter of a shilling. It could hardly amount to 3 or 4 pounds in a year. A mudlark might find enough to bring a few pence on a good day, which would include a half-pound of coal, a few nails, and possibly, if they were lucky, a discarded tool. Nothing at all on a bad day, though. To supplement this, some mudlarks turned to petty theft, which is extremely dangerous and involves stealing small items from unattended boats. A piece of bread, some boiled potatoes, possibly a night in a doss house, were their only sources of income, because they had no expenses, living on the streets in subpar housing, and possibly eating food scraps or the cheapest bread. In order to pay for a shared meal, child mudlarks occasionally joined forces with parents or siblings. Many of them were in danger of starvation because of how precarious their existence was. They had no savings, and were unable to work if they became ill or hurt. Mudlarks frequently resorted to begging when it was feasible, because on a good day, even begging could produce more than the mud of the river. To put it briefly, mudlarking offered little more than enough to get by, and frequently less. Mudlarks were generally regarded by Victorians with a mixture of sympathy and disgust. They represented the most impoverished people. They were ragged, mud-caked urchins that shocked anyone who came across them, and Mayhew said that they were certainly the most deplorable in appearance of any I have met. Many middle-class and upper-class spectators thought of mudlarks as pathetic street children, similar to the impoverished beggars or crossing sweepers. However, there was also a regrettable propensity to blame the impoverished for their own circumstances. Some perceived mudlarks as vagrants or truants who opted for a lazy life of scavenging, rather than proper employment, ignoring the fact that you would hire a child without shoes and covered in sewage, of course. Not the best impression at the interview. Mudlarks weren't as common in literature and the media as pickpockets or chimney sweepers. You probably not heard of them. But when they were used as representations of filth. It wasn't like the pickpockets and chimney sweepers in movies like Oliver, where it's this. No, they're dirty, fine, yes, they're criminals, but it's accompanied by the song and dance, and it's romanticized somewhat. Mudlarks were nothing like that. Mudlarks were absolutely miserable. They were occasionally, even though to be bothersome, or small-time criminals prowling the docks. Sometimes, especially if they were suspected of stealing, the law would round them up and send them to reformatories or workhouses. Perhaps a step up. However, the traditional mudlark became less common as sewers and river cleanliness marginally improved toward the end of the century. Of course, they were primarily viewed as these tragic characters of Victorian times, with children and the elderly women wading in poisonous mud for a few scraps. Today, observers like us frequently romanticize them as tough scavengers. Either way, they were living proof of the poverty and filth that industrial wealth had not yet eradicated, and their existence contradicted Victorian notions of progress, right there on the river for everyone to see. Although some kind-hearted people made an effort to assist the mudlarks by providing other jobs or care, Mayhew himself describes helping one boy land a job as a printer, by the way. Mudlarks generally continued to live on the periphery of society, with the exception of a startling tale about the extremes of poverty. They operated in the shadow of London's affluence, and were mainly, like all the others, disregarded. Okay, so next up on the list of dream jobs, we have the sewer tosher, which sounds exactly as bad as it is. Toshers, also known as sewer hunters, were daring scavengers who ventured into the maze-like sewers of London, once London had sewers, in order to retrieve misplaced valuables. The city's sewer system was outdated, of course, overflowing labyrinth that carried waste beneath the streets by the Victorian era. Entering these sewers, occasionally via manholes or intercepting drains, and looking through the raw sewage for anything of value was how these toshers earned their living. Coins dropped down grates, pieces of jewelry, or cutlery washed from sinks, scrap metal, and even the occasional misplaced watch or ring were actually common finds. But to rake through the sludge and debris, they employed long poles with hooks or hose on the end. They scooped and sorted as they methodically worked in small groups through the mess. A few coins, or maybe some tools and copper nails that fell from workshops upstream, could be considered a good haul. Toshers kept these in their leather aprons, pockets, or in sacks. Later, the loot would be cleaned up and either pawned or sold for money. In essence, they viewed the sewer as a possible treasure trove hidden beneath the surface. It was frequently a covert operation because of the health and potential legal ramifications. Many Toshers worked at night or in the early morning to avoid being discovered. Now, as for the sewers, you might imagine that they were not in the best of shape. Imagine wading through raw sewage that is knee or thigh deep, foul-smelling mixtures of urine, industrial chemicals, human waste, and trash that is moving slowly through brick tunnels with very little airflow. Toshers usually wore heavy boots and old patched canvas pants, a leather apron usually, and well, occasionally a cloth around their nose and mouth. To provide light in the complete darkness, they fastened lanterns to their chests. The tunnels were small inside, with some parts requiring stooping or even crawling. There were places where the oxygen content of the foul air could be oppressively low. Along the walls or around their feet, they had to contend with hordes of sewer rats. When upstream sluice gates were opened or during periods of heavy rain, abrupt flushes of water could surge through, sending a wave of waste that could knock a man off his feet and subsequently drown him. The constant fear of being swept away certainly helped keep them vigilant, but the physical surroundings were also dangerous, because old brickwork could suddenly collapse. Some tunnels featured sump holes or steep drops. For safety, Toshers frequently worked in groups. One could stand watch, or assist a friend in climbing or escaping if necessary. They spoke in a strangely resonant shouts or whispers, slogging through sucking mire, carrying a sack of scrap metal, and shoveling through thick filth was back-breaking work. Naturally, the dim light of oil lanterns, was responsible for everything, creating unsettling shadows in an area that most people wouldn't venture to visit. Keeping a low profile, slipping out of a manhole with their finds, hopefully before anyone noticed, that was all part of the job. Even though these men probably stank to high heaven above ground after a sewer foray, I'm sure you'd probably smell them before you saw them. One of the riskiest occupations, that's what it was. Toxic and explosive gases were present in the sewers. Methane or hydrogen sulfide pockets could suffocate a tosher or spontaneously catch fire. Many people carried a candle as a makeshift gas detector. If it suddenly died, it was time to run because of the contaminated air. Additionally, there was a direct risk of disease. Coming into contact with deadly pathogens could cause cholera, typhoid, dysentery, etc. And the dirty water could easily infect cuts or scratches, causing severe illness or even death. Sewer workers were also at risk for rat bite fever and other illnesses due to the possibility of being bitten by swarming rats. If a tosher makes a mistake in dark waters, they could be completely dunked down, ingesting sewage or possibly drowning if they panic. The abrupt floods of wastewater were also well known, especially during periods of intense precipitation. The flow could be made a trickle 1 minute, and then a wall of water the next. Toshers might be beaten up against tunnel walls, or carried away and drowned in the sewage. Another nightmare scenario was tunnel collapses, where an old brick ceiling might fall and trap, crushing the Tosher. Even in the absence of accidents, the job could be taxing. Continual exposure to filth caused lung problems, infections, and skin diseases due to the miasma. Their lives were probably also shortened by the stress and fear they endured. Given that starvation was frequently the alternative, it is telling that Toshers continued to operate in spite of these risks. And speaking of money and all the rest, a Tosher's income was entirely based on the treasure they discovered. So there was no set salary. It's all up to you. Surprisingly, compared to other slum jobs, some people found it profitable despite the risks. Coins and metal worth a few shillings could be found during a successful sewer night. A Tosher could make a lot of money if they discover a silver spoon or perhaps some jewelry. A silver spoon could sell for several shillings, you know. Numerous coins, bits of plate, and other items ended up in the muck, according to Mayhew's account. Although it was very unpredictable, a Tosher might typically produce 1 or 2 shillings of scrap and coin in a day. A gold ring, or a few misplaced pennies, could be found on some nights, while others would be fruitless. Toshers were free to practice their trade prior to 1840, but they had to be cunning after it became illegal rather, to enter sewers without authorization. Their haul had to outweigh the additional risks or fines or jail time, but that didn't stop them. Coins were either spent or kept. Due to the group nature, they occasionally combined fines and divided profits, particularly when one man made a significant discovery. One of the reasons why the job remained alluring is that there are stories of some seasoned Toshers making enough money to feed their families and even dress a little better than mudlarks or purefinders. Even so, a Tosher's pay might have been comparable to that of unskilled workers, a few shillings per week on average, albeit with much more variation. In essence, it was similar to gambling in a sewer. You get rich one day, you get poor the next. But they continued because of that small chance that they might hit the jackpot down there somewhere in the drains. Toshers were viewed as members of the city's shadowy underclass like everybody else mentioned in this one, who were frequently criminalized, mainly invisible. Although they probably cleared some blockages by removing debris, authorities saw them as trespassers and accused them of causing damage to the sewer infrastructure or creating blockages. Toshers were specifically targeted by a law that was passed in 1840 that prohibited entering the sewers without authorization. But that did not stop them. The Toshers had to work covertly, which gave their persona a hint of Robin Hood, if we could put it that way. Toshers may have been admired by the impoverished for their courage and the sporadic tale of striking it rich underground. Because of their unique clothing and equipment, some Londoners may have recognized these men when they saw them walking to a manhole with a lantern and hook in hand. Sewer hunters were generally viewed by the general public with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Middle-class readers shuddered at the thought of people literally swimming in sewage for money after journalists like Henry Mayhew spoke about it. The Toshers were frequently grouped with other scavenger occupations as proof of the impoverished people's resourcefulness and desperation. But the Tosher era gradually faded as the modern closed sewer system, established after the reconstruction of the Basilicat in 1860s, took over. Daring sewer pirates from a bygone London, they became almost legendary. In conclusion, people were glad they didn't have to go down into the sewers, even though Victorians probably thought of them as vile criminals or pathetic desperados, depending on one's level of compassion. In the depths of the city's underworld, the memories of the Toshers are both as heroes of survival and also outlaws. Right, next one. The crossing sweeper. An impoverished youngster, known as a crossing sweeper, would stake out a portion of the street, usually a busy intersection or crossing, and keep it clear of trash, mud, and horse manure, so that people could dress without getting their boots or dresses dirty. Many pedestrians welcomed this service during a time where the streets were filthy, covered in dust and trash, and of course a lot of horse dung. To quickly clear a path, the crossing sweeper would wait until they noticed a well-dressed individual about to leave a curb before leaping forward with a broom. They did not have a schedule or an employer, so they worked informally. And every sweeper selected a patch of the street and made an effort to keep it noticeably cleaner than the neighborhood. The sweeper would frequently move forward when a prospective customer crossed, constantly sweeping to make sure the following few yards were clear. Kind of like a weird game of curling. With an outstretched hand or cap, the child may follow the person who crossed in hope of receiving a tip for the service. When several affluent individuals arrived, the child hurried back and forth, making every effort to serve them all. They frequently swept vigorously while addressing people politely, saying things like, "Allow me, sir." In essence, these young business people transformed a broom and fast feet into a means of surviving. Clever work. Not a bad idea. In addition to physically sweeping, their duties included establishing diplomatic claims to territory and occasionally repelling rival sweepers and children and gaining enough favor to be paid. Working in the open street, crossing sweepers were subject to all types of weather condition, as well as the ongoing dangers of city traffic. The street turned to sludge when it rained, and swirled with dust when it didn't. A sweeper may stand on a corner for hours on end, inhaling the smoke and manure stench. They had to jump between moving carts and carriages if they were not careful. A wheel or horse could run them over. Even though it might be extremely cold in the winter, they'd still be out there, possibly in their ragged clothing, shoveling slush or snow as far away as they could. The heat and the smell, well, the summer would make that unbearable. They had no official claim on the location, though, which made their job more difficult because they could be ejected by police officers for being beggars or having their spotless crossing ruined by more muck being washed over it by street sprinklers. Their primary tool was a broom, which was frequently used and second-hand. Many crossing sweepers felt every cold spot and jagged rock because they were barefoot, or at least ill-shod. They also needed to stay alert because another urchin might take over if they left their crossing even for a short time, like to get water or follow a tip. As a result, it was a persistent, nervous presence on the corner of the street. They were frequently shouted at or ignored in social situations. They would listen to the sound of the hoofs, the cries of those passing by, and sometimes the taunts of onlookers who thought that they were an annoyance. Despite these challenges, many people chose it over direct begging, because at least they were helping others, and felt somewhat respected when a nice woman smiled and gave them a penny. In any case, a crossing sweeper's life was full of illness and peril. As previously stated, there was a significant risk of traffic accidents, because small children could be easily trampled when they darted in front of horses. In such incidents, some kids suffered broken bones or worse. Additionally, they were continuously breathing in dust and all manner of filth, which increased their risk of lung infections and persistent coughing. Frequent colds, pneumonia, and other illnesses resulted from being outside in all weather conditions with insufficient clothing. Due to their weakened immune systems, and the fact that many sweepers were homeless, or from extremely low-income families, malnutrition was widespread. They were also exposed to disease-causing agents by working among the trash of the streets, although the link to the contaminated dirt was not entirely clear. Victorian streets during cholera outbreaks were particularly dangerous. Additionally, crossing sweepers could hurt themselves by slipping on cobblestones or using their brooms. For a child, the job could be extremely stressful because of the ongoing concern about earning money, the potentially violent territorial disputes with other homeless kids, and the general roughness of life on the streets. Some were the targets of bullying or exploitation by gangs or older boys who might tax their corner, or simply just beat them up and take their money. Many sweepers started at dawn and stayed out until dusk, constantly on the lookout, rarely resting, so mental and physical exhaustion, well, that was all but inevitable. They lived day in, day out in danger, rejection, cold, and hunger for a meager wage. They relied solely on tips to make their ends meet. They had no guaranteed income. In exchange for a timely sweep, generous pedestrians might give a penny or two. Some donated bread crusts, farthings or halfpennies. Most just ignored them and gave them nothing. After all, they didn't ask for the service. In a busy area of town, a conscientious child could earn several pence on a good day. Crossing sweepers hoped for the occasional copper from onlookers, which is essentially an income comparable to begging. In an effort to add a little stability, some wealthy people adopted a regular crossing sweeper and made it a point to tip their local child every day. Earnings, however, were inconsistent overall. On a wet day, there'd be fewer people around, therefore fewer tips. Or on the other hand, a messier street would make their service more necessary, but more difficult to perform. They indirectly save money on clothing by sweeping and preventing muck from ruining their clothes, but don't be fooled. The majority of crossing sweepers barely made ends meet. Some days, there was nothing at all, but if they were lucky, you could expect 4 to 6 pence a day. Just a little bread and possibly a doss house bed for the night could be purchased with this amount of money. They also had to perform odd jobs or beg in their free time, if we are to call it that. Notably, Dickens and other authors occasionally depicted kind-hearted men giving a poor sweeper half a crown, or substantial 2.5 shillings, but in practice that would have been extremely uncommon. Therefore, even though the public paid them, the rate was low and completely determined by others. In Victorian cities, crossing sweepers were a common sight, and frequently provoked a mixture of pity and derision. The genteel classes frequently appeared in Victorian literature as archetypes of the deserving poor, because they found a small boy sweeping a path with earnestness to be both pathetic and enduring in a sentimental way. Since they at least made an effort to earn their money, many people thought they were superior to ordinary beggars. Indeed, it was common to refer to crossing sweepers as just a step up from beggars. They were cited by some philanthropists as proof that poverty and child labor needed to be addressed, but on the other hand, some people thought they were just an annoyance, especially riders or coachmen, who might have to slow down for a child who was running around, or pedestrians who saw an overzealous sweeper hounding them for a tip. One can imagine that is annoying. Either way, crossing sweepers were occasionally ridiculed as petty or cheeky in historical caricatures and illustrations. However, they also gained some notoriety, According to a possibly fictitious tale, Queen Victoria even invited a crossing sweeper to her wedding, highlighting their status as representations of the underprivileged. They began to disappear, however, as the 19th century went on, and cities began to organize street cleaning. but for a large portion of Victoria's reign, they served as a constant reminder of the glaring class divide. Ragged kids, making room for lords and elegantly dressed ladies. Sometimes their presence pricked society's conscience. Sometimes. Overall, the society that created the need for crossing sweepers provided little systemic assistance to them, but they were accepted and occasionally treated with kindness by individuals. Many Victorian memoirs contain memories of a specific little crossing sweeper, demonstrating how these kids were subtly assimilated into the urban fabric and continued to represent the make-do mentality of the urban poor. And finally, we reach number 5. This one's a little bit different. I've saved the most interesting one to last. Perhaps not what you were expecting. The Resurrectionist, also known as the body snatcher. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Was the macabre practice of exhuming recently buried bodies and selling them to medical schools for dissection was practiced by resurrectionists, also known as body snatchers, in the early 19th century, overlapping with the early Victorian years. Even though legal changes caused the practice to decline in the middle of the Victorian era, it still had a negative impact on employment during that time. These people, who frequently worked in gangs, would scout cemeteries at night, find recent burials, ideally of those impoverished, whose graves had fewer safeguards, and just dig up the coffin. Because damaged bodies were less valuable, it was their grim duty to remove the body without causing any harm. They frequently did this by tunneling at the head of the coffin, cracking it open, and removing the corpse by the arms. To avoid being noticed by family members or cemetery watchmen watching the grave, they had to work fast, but quietly. To conceal the theft, they would rebury the empty coffin after the body was recovered. After that, the body would be placed in straw-filled sacks or crates and delivered, typically at night or right on dawn, to a surgeon or anatomy instructor who'd be willing to pay. I'm serious. This actually happened. It happened all the time. Of course, at any given time, resurrectionists needed to know which private anatomy lecturers or medical schools were purchasing the bodies. In essence, they participated in a covert supply chain as suppliers. They went straight to murder in well-known cases like Burke and Hare in order to obtain bodies, although they were not considered body snatchers because they killed rather than dug up. Their case highlighted the demand. We'll talk more about them. However, the majority of resurrection men continued to just do it the old-fashioned way. Dig. A successful night could include 1 to 3 body thefts. Important duties include finding a target, excavating effectively, moving a bulky body, and haggling over payment with the reticent surgeons. The working conditions were, as one might expect, pretty appalling. The snatchers operated in cemeteries and in the dark, usually during bad weather because it was less likely they would be discovered. Rainy and moonless nights were ideal. Under tremendous time pressure and stress, they carried out strenuous manual labor, such as moving heavy earth and digging with a shovel. The surroundings were a mixture of the smell of recently turned earth and the early stages of decomposition. They occasionally exhumed bodies, only a day or 2 after burial, so the corpses were largely undamaged. But other times, if they were not careful, they would come across a body that was already decaying, which was not only less valuable, but physically repulsive. For their own safety, and because doctors might reject them, they usually avoided coffins of people who died of highly contagious diseases. But really, you couldn't be sure what you'd find. They were exposed to blood, bodily fluids, and illness while handling corpses. They frequently only had sacks, shovels, and crowbars as tools. In winter, the work was even more difficult if the ground was frozen. Additionally, while they dug, they were required to remain silent, speaking in only gestures and whispers, because graveyards might have armed guards, and citizens occasionally organized watch groups. There was a great fear of being discovered. In order to deter the body snatchers, traps such as spring guns or coffin torpedoes, basically explosive devices, have been reported, and that pose a real threat. It's not a new thing. Think about the old grave robbing problems we have in different parts of the world. People generally don't want it to happen, and if it does happen, they certainly want to make it as unpleasant for the thieves as possible. But of course, getting the body is one thing. Then you have to transport it. And this process through quiet city streets after they had recovered was just as nerve-wracking. If somebody happened to stumble upon a cart carrying a corpse in the middle of the night, it could turn into a mob lynching. Imagine that. Walking through the streets, every little noise, heart racing, while riding that little rattling cart with a corpse wrapped in a sack at your feet. Extremely stressful, very gory, full of crime and death. This profession came with both legal and physical risks, you see. Body snatchers ran the risk of catching diseases from the cadavers. For example, a body that died of cholera or tuberculosis, well, that might still be infected. And you do not want to get cholera or tuberculosis. They may sustain also cuts or injuries from broken coffin wood, coffin nails. Scratches could also become septic, or even while digging. It's bad for your back. Rheumatism or illness were frequently the results of exertion on chilly, rainy nights. Many likely experienced psychological trauma because of their fear of being captured and the ongoing close contact with the dead. But the greatest danger was being apprehended by the police, or perhaps even more dangerous, irate family members. Regardless, the vigilantes continued to administer street justice, despite the fact that body snatching was only a misdemeanor, believe it or not. But interesting, stealing a body wasn't a felony under British law because the corpse wasn't considered property. Yeah, nice little fact for you there. Either way, that did not stop the vicious mob beatings. And, well, it's probably something I would turn a blind eye to as well. They risked fines or jail time if they were caught by the actual law, as well as public shame. Some churchyards employed armed patrols to put up heavy mort safes, iron cages over graves, that is. A body snatcher attempting to get past them might be just shot on sight. Then there is the case of Burke and Hare, which we have mentioned, who began as shady body dealers but turned to murder, raising the possibility that any resurrection man could cross that line. The public's hatred of body snatchers peaked after their crimes were made public, because suspicion of serious robbing could spark riots. Resurrectionists of the later era thus operated in greater danger. They were also at risk when transporting corpses. If a constable stopped them and discovered a body, they were done for. Some body snatchers had escape plans or carried weapons for pursuits across cemeteries because of the high stakes. One mistake could result in death at the hands of others, or at least incarceration. But the financial lure persisted in spite of everything. Due to the lack of legality around the obtained bodies, medical schools and private anatomy lecturers were willing to pay handsome fees for fresh cadavers. Early in the 1800s, a single corpse could bring anywhere up to £10, which is about several hundred US today. In the Victorian era, an adult corpse in London would normally cost about £4, more if it was in good condition, less for a child, which, we don't want to talk about that, don't we? Given that a worker may make only £1 per week, one person's wages could cover a month or more so that's certainly tempting. Even so, 2 men splitting £4 for a night's work was profitable, but that's if they could pull it off regularly. Resurrectionists typically worked in teams and divided the profits. In Edinburgh, the notorious Burke and Hare were paid between £7 and £10 per body, which of course pushed them to take drastic measures. Frequently, their money was paid in cash, discreetly, and without inquiry. Due to its legality, the trade was based on supply and demand, with prices rising as demand peaked during winter months, during dissection season, when bodies were kept longer and medical classes were in season. A few body snatchers turned it into a semi-regular occupation, possibly making a meagre living that was on par with that of a skilled craftsman, albeit occasionally. But there was a great deal of unpredictability, you see. Sometimes you'd score several bodies. Other nights you'd just get nothing, due to the guards, the soil being too hard. Yeah. I guess you could say it was a dead industry. Well, the Anatomy Act of 1832, which permitted medical schools to use unclaimed bodies, such as those from workhouses, thereby undermining the black market, also closed the window for making large sums of money as public awareness increased. The traditional resurrectionist trade essentially died out after that. It was buried. However, in the early years of the period, body snatching was a quick, if morbid way for those who were too desperate or bold to make other amounts of money in different ways. Of course, the public, they feared and hated body snatchers everywhere. No one pitied them. They were perhaps the most hated of these professions that I've listed. Not because they were disgusting or smelly or anything else, just because they were morally reprehensible. They offended Victorian religious and moral sensibilities by violating the sanctity of the grave. There was a great deal of fear and rage at the thought of a loved one's body might be dug up and taken away for dissection. As a result, people started forming vigilante groups, guarding cemeteries, bought heavy coffin locks, and so forth. Now, public outrage was sparked when newspapers reported on ghouls caught in the act. That was the revelation of Burke and Hare's crimes in 1828, which technically went beyond body snatching to include body supplying through murder. It was a scandal that appalled the entire British public. To kill someone for anatomical gain, the word burking even made its way into the language. Nonetheless, the public had not forgotten the incidents that continued into the early Victorian era, late 1830s. When apprehended, the body snatchers were subjected to extrajudicial punishment. It was not common for a vengeful mob to severely beat a resurrection man or to toss rocks and trash at him while being transported to court. They were effectively a boogeyman in popular culture. Parents would scare their kids by telling them if they misbehaved, the body snatchers would come and get you. The horrifying trade is remembered as one of the most ghoulish jobs in history, a dark aspect of Victorian life that most people were eager to put behind them forever. They forced society to face the tension between moral ethics and medical advancement. Well, thank you very much for listening, everyone. Did you enjoy that? It was all a little bit grim and macabre, but I know you like it. So let me thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulf, Ednea, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Melissa, Madeline, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, the HMSHH, Crystal, and Towery. Okay, well, do you want some more Victorian stuff? I could probably do more. I can talk about more stuff. Perhaps you want me to talk about Jack the Ripper, or perhaps you want me to talk about some other horrible time in history. How about you tell me in the comments? That would be good. And it boosts the engagement. We all know this. Allow me to say, as I always do, good night, and lots of love to you all.